Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and licensed mental health counselor. And today is Veterans Day, November 11th. And for today's topic, we're going to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And, just from a personal note, this is the day that I always celebrate my father. My father was a veteran of World War II, and he was in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And so I always take a moment on that to bring flowers to the monument and stuff. And I didn't know him before, obviously, before he went to war, but I understand that when he came back, he was a little bit different. He was a different man. So, he never talked about it. I never mentioned it. Never mentioned about what it was like. And the only thing he ever said to me was when I became draft eligible, he told me, "Don't go in the Army." And then instead, I went in the Air Force. Yeah. But so this is a day, and I think it's probably. And again, we're not going to do like, here's how you diagnose it, but here's what you look for, and talk a little bit about how people get better.
Yeah, but I think like. Well, we've heard a lot about that generation, the World War II and afterwards when they came home, is they didn't talk about it. There's a lot of silence about it. You just kind of went about your life, and it just wasn't a topic of discussion. It certainly wasn't brought up in mental health circles as something that needed treatment, right?
Right.
Yeah, but we know it's been around for a long time. What is called battle fatigue, shell shock, and I think it was after the Vietnamese War when people started actually talking about their symptoms, and when they came back, that people started talking about this as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
Right, and I think in some ways there was a lot of. I remember when it came out, the diagnosis. I mean, and there was a lot of confusion about it. Like, what are we treating? As you know, the different symptoms that people have. I looked at the new DSM-5,
right,
and they have like 20 symptoms. I mean, it's a list of things, and some of them look like symptoms of depression. Some of them look like they're different characteristics and stuff. And I think one of my concerns about talking about this tonight is that I really don't want to stigmatize veterans who have fought and who have, done what they've done. We don't want to label them as having mental illness and that, but at the same time, I want people to feel comfortable saying, when you're exposed to trauma, and for some people, it affects them,
right,
and it affects people in different ways, and it comes upon them in different ways, and so. In my reading, they were talking about some of the things that might be happened before the trauma, some of the experiences that happened during the trauma, and then again some of the things that happened afterwards. And so you almost have to look at the whole picture. Like I knew when I had friends that were going to Vietnam, I mean, sometimes it was sort of. I used to think some of the guys that I knew took their problems with them. Right. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just mean that, in some ways, like they were already troubled, and they would sign up for the Marines, or they would, they would be in the Army. And it was not, I guess I shouldn't use troubles, but in some ways they were sort of struggling, like a lot of adolescents, and myself included, even when I went in the Air Force. I mean, it was sort of like, the idea is you're always going to find yourself in the service, or something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, something does happen, but it's not always beneficial.
Well, I think, and there's some, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about there's some misconceptions around PTSD, and particularly around veterans, that everyone who goes to war is traumatized. 100% of the vets are coming back with PTSD. And looking at the statistics from the VA, the Veterans Administration, around returning from the Middle East theater, they're looking at a rate of about 20% of returning veterans struggling with PTSD. And so it's not everybody who gets this when they're exposed to trauma. But another piece, too, is that it's not like they're unstable. This is sort of an illness that does sort of impact and cause some discomfort and some dysfunction. But it's not like they're unstable. So that idea of the sort of they're prone to violence and that they're going postal, right? That they're the ones that sort of shooting up areas like the Navy Yard recently. Yeah. Those are really sort of spectacular exceptions, and that they are not the norm in any fashion.
No, and I think that's, I'm glad you said that. I mean, almost always, and the same thing, is that really narrow 0.001% of people who go there. Most of the men that I know, and I know personally and also professionally, they just were troubled. I mean, life wasn't easy for them. I remember reading one of the symptoms of PTSD is that sometimes these people are just not happy.
Right.
I mean, that's really sad.
Yeah.
I mean, I realize what I just said, but I mean,
Yeah.
it is. I mean, when you realize that a symptom of an illness could be just the inability to feel happiness, to feel like sometimes, and this will come up in other ways, and we'll talk more about that perhaps when we talk about sexual victims, but sometimes there's a combination of shame and guilt. Sometimes they have guilt over what they did, or what they saw, or what they were part of, but the one that really cripples them sometimes is shame.
Yeah.
And shame is what keeps you quiet. Shame is what immobilizes you. And guilt, and I know everybody's heard this, but guilt is something that is about something you did. Shame is about who you are. And I think sometimes, I think they want to make believe it didn't happen, and they want it to go away. And I don't think it works that way. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to this to not be afraid of talking about what's going on, talking about the things that they, perhaps you could say more, but what they call cues and avoidance. That avoidance doesn't work.
Oh yeah, and I mean I don't want the guide that we have around this long list, laundry list of symptoms you're talking about. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM, and just came out in like the 5th edition, which a lot of criticism about that. But I think so, not necessarily wanting to give a lot of validity to that that manual, but clearly we know if bad things happen to you, then we react in certain ways, and there's a range of sort of how we're going to react to that. So, but at least I guess we have to talk somewhat about the diagnostic criteria. But of course, the first thing is the actual event. The stressor itself, and this can be something that's either directly experienced, but it even goes farther than that. It could also be having witnessed something like death or war for that matter. And even sort of indirectly, so sort of knowing someone intimately who has experienced some sort of trauma like this, you can also be traumatized yourself.
Right.
And then it sort of breaks down into the various sort of symptoms that people have. And the first is being sort of the re-experiencing symptoms, or the intrusions. So you can't get the thoughts out of your mind. You might have flashbacks, you're having nightmares. And then another set is around the arousal. Now they've talked basically in the sort of arousal cluster about people, places, and things that you would associate with the trauma. So obviously, if going back into war, what might be something that would excite that, or being under attack would be something that sort of bring you back to that. You might avoid certain, say, alleys where something bad had happened to you. But the idea, you just don't want to kind of be there. You're going to avoid this. Now, of course, as you're saying, if that's your long-term strategy, then that's going to sort of reinforce that behavior. But we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But there's this new category with the new manual that's called negative, negative alterations of your thinking and of your mood. And this is where we talk about things like blaming yourself, having forgetfulness, being shamed by what had happened. Of course, you're blaming yourself for others, as well as a sort of an alienation, feeling that you're apart or separate. I mean, I think if we look at the actual active trauma, that idea of sort of being pulled away and alone and isolated is a very big piece of that. And then, of course, depressed, sort of I'm depressed, I don't have an interest in anything, is a very large part of it.
And I'd like to, just to go back to the very beginning, I think sometimes people see gory things in movies and stuff, and they go, oh, well, or you see, things that happen, but it's like watching a picture of a car accident on TV. You can look at it, right? But try and remember what it felt like when you're in that car accident.
Right.
When when the crash and the bang and the or anything. So this traumatic event is really like I was in a terrible car accident, and I have some amnesia about it. I can't really tell you exactly what happened. I was in the car, and then I was in the emergency room, well, getting a guy dropping holy water on my forehead.
Thinking that was it.
So I mean, and No, but and I was reading about this, that sometimes there's this amnesia, there's this disassociation. And I can remember at one point working in the hospital, we were working with sexual victims. And they would talk about dissociative states. And you know, it was really, people would make sort of light of it and say, well, you know, if you remember, if you're good on the highway and you miss your exit and you come out of it and you missed your exit, you go, well, that's a disassociation.
Yeah.
But that's...
Well, I mean, like anything, it comes in a spectrum.
Right.
So a lot of what happens to us in trauma is really very sort of natural responses. So again, with the idea that having experienced trauma does not mean you develop PTSD. So you talk about sort of an acute stress reaction. So anybody who's been, say, a motor vehicle accident or been attacked, you're going to have these periods where you're very jumpy. You're looking over your shoulder. You're vigilant, but people often describe that as being paranoid. And you're jumpy. You startle quite easily. You're not sleeping very well. You have a hard time forgetting what had just happened. But if all goes, if you process that well, then you'll find that over the course of a month, these symptoms start to decline. And then you don't have PTSD, but you have this bad thing that happened to you. And a lot of this is a protective mechanism. We want to avoid things that are harmful to us. It's like touching the stove and not doing, not burning your finger again. That's sort of how we're wired, is how we survived. And it's when it gets into the realm of we're being stuck in it, that then it's no longer healthy for us. It no longer seems to be protective.
Yeah, and in my business, and I want to remember to come back to this, because when I was doing some of the research, looking at it, there was a category, and my experience has always been with adults, but there was this category of 6 to 18 who had PTSD.
Which is something new.
Which is something new, but also I thought, my goodness, how many adolescents may have PTSD that people don't see it. Because I tend to always think adult, combat, older adult victims and stuff, and I don't believe that some kids are articulate enough, or people are wise enough to sort of see it. Now, maybe they are in schools. Right. I know they do a better job, but I was really struck by that, thinking about that. Imagine being 8 years old or 10 years old and having PTSD.
Right, yeah.
I mean, that would be...
And I was looking at sort of World Health Organization criteria around treatment for this. And so what you might see in children who are not able to verbalize what had happened to them, what they're feeling, is pretty regressive sorts of behaviors. So, I mean, you'll see irritability, you'll see poor sleep. Children who sort of just learned to speak will sort of lose the ability to speak, like as if they've forgotten how to talk. Bedwetting or losing your toilet training is something too. So, and I think like we talked about last week with this Child First program out of Yale, a lot of the disruptive, aggressive kids in school are acting out and often wind up being expelled even from daycares. That they've probably had some adverse events, and what we're actually seeing is they're sort of working through PTSD at that level. And
I mentioned it just before the show today. New York Times op-ed article was about guys who get less than honorable discharges from the service. Now, some of them are bad actors and they're just inappropriate for the service. But this article said that some of them actually are suffering and might have to do with like previous experience in the service. In other words, they're going up on their second tour or third tour or something, and the company commander sort of decides what kind of discharge you get. Do you get general, less than honorable, and all that type of thing. And the whole idea of this op-ed article was that we should be more mindful of that there is a system in place for guys who have less than honorable discharges. They normally don't get VA benefits. But there is a system out there where they can apply, and it's a lengthy application process to get that discharge changed. But it is something I think that we ought to take a look at, that maybe there are some veterans that are being discharged. And it's sort of like you were saying, that what is now seen as really negative behavior may really be part of a symptom of some other issues.
So they're having PTSD, and those symptoms are adding to are giving the impression of these things, these behaviors that's being interpreted as being a bad actor, and therefore less than honorable discharge.
And the other thing, and as you know, I mean, almost all my work has always been with dual disorders, and my job has been alcohol and drug addiction treatment and stuff, is the role of alcohol and drugs in PTSD. I don't know statistically what the comorbidity is, I mean the co-occurring of it, but it is definitely a part of it. And I think some of it has to do with treatment of symptoms. I mean, I think some of it has to do with, I guess, arousal even. I mean, a way of relaxing. I think some of it, I mean, I can't explain it all. All I know is that it's, from my experience, is that for a lot of people, it's a common thread. You know, there's substance abuse and substance dependency and PTSD. And again, you know, from my perspective, I always used to recommend sobriety first, because I felt like, you know, you can't make progress on the other illness if you're still drinking and using.
Right.
But you were talking about how to approach that.
Yeah, oh, yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I think that the way I've looked at this, and it's not just my take on it, is that drug use would be considered a type of avoidance, right? So not just sort of people, places, and things, but sort of thoughts and feelings that you have around that. But you're right, because just like we used to do with, say, depression and alcoholism, where we would often send people to different, there was a right door and a wrong door, right? That you might complain about depression and you have alcoholism, we would say, well, you've got to go take care of the alcoholism first. And then you get to the substance counselors and say, no, no, you need to go take care of the depression first. I thought we run into the same thing with PTSD as well, that often we say, well, you know, you've got to get sobriety first. You have to be in recovery from your addictions before we can think about treating your PTSD. And that does a disservice to people, because then we're having them get treatment in a serial fashion. First this thing, then that thing, which really ignores kind of the whole person. So in a way, the thinking to change that, to have things going in parallel, because both of these are very serious problems, and there are stages to treatment of anything, right? So with trauma treatment, of course, the first thing is you have to be out of that traumatic environment. So you're taken away from the war theater, you're taken away from the battlefield, or you have to, as we talked about last week, you have to leave that violent situation in your home if you're suffering from domestic violence. So that safety, that physical safety, is the first really stage you have to have. And then entering into sort of a therapeutic relationship and being able to learn how to deal with your stress, because that is very important to kind of develop a toolbox that allows you to deal with the hypervigilance, the arousal, the depression, the anxiety, and to start doing those things. And then eventually what you do is you get to a point then where you're actually able to then delve into the trauma, but there has to be a lot of preparation along the way. But so with you, and then if you look at, say, detox or getting into substance treatment, you know, you can simultaneously get into a safe environment, enter the hospital, and go through withdrawal, and then have these things go in parallel, because clearly you cannot do serious treatment around trauma if you're also using drugs at the same time. Right.
I think, though, if you don't mind, I mean, I worked with a young man, and he was going down to Leeds. He was from the Northampton area. And he talked
about the VA in Leeds,
the VA, and he would talk about going up on one floor and getting counseling around his substance abuse, and then going down to another floor, the basement actually, and picking up his prescription. And you know, they would get there, and you know, it was fairly common wear their fatigues, and they would all trade their drugs, and they would have benzodiazepines or whatever it might be, Klonopin, some antidepressants, some pain relief. Some of them had injuries, and very quickly, and I don't mean this. Well, you've heard me say this before, but they really get to a point where they begin to think they're self-medicating. And they sort of mix in street drugs with the drugs they get from the VA, and it all became one formula. Is that how you say it?
Or like these, what they call farm parties that a lot of these kids are doing, where, you know, whatever pills you get together.
But they saw themselves as treating each other. You know, like these vets were helping other vets. You know, I got this, I can give you this, and I have this pill, and you can take this for bed. And I think, you know, I've heard this term by other people, but I think when I used to hear from vets saying they're self-medicating. And you'll hear that with booze, you'll hear it with other drugs. And I have no doubt that it probably helps them with their symptoms on some level, but it really, in my opinion, it's only making things worse.
Oh, absolutely.
And you know, I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, I want to give them some relief on their symptoms, and you know, well-meaning people will sometimes recommend it. And I know that I've read this, that the VA feels like sometimes they're sort of trapped. You know, they want to treat the symptoms, they want to give them some stability, they want to, you know, and at the same time they know that they're, you know, at risk for substance abuse, if not substance dependency.
Because I think, like we heard from Marianne Copeland a couple of weeks ago, there's this sense of responsibility for your own treatment. And it's a very passive approach, sort of relying on medications. And getting sober and having recovered from addiction is very important for you to be a well-engaged partner in your treatment. And we're realizing now, too, I mean, when you talk about benzodiazepines in particular, that it was thought, well, this is this was thought of as an anxiety disorder, PTSD, and the benzodiazepines are an effective, anxiety medication. But what they have noticed is that they're actually counterproductive to trauma. Studying groups who have experienced natural disasters, one group given benzodiazepines to help sort of minimize that anxiety and all that reactivity. Another group not given benzodiazepines. The group that was given benzodiazepines had a higher likelihood of developing post-traumatic stress disorder after this acute stress happened. And then, too, I mean, even ignoring the possibility of addiction with the benzodiazepines, we're learning, too, that they actually maybe lead to a longer duration for PTSD. And whether it's sort of clouding the emotions, clouding the thinking, they're not helpful either for acutely after the trauma, right after the trauma, or even for the long-term treatment of PTSD. So I think we're finally getting some attention to the fact that there are good medications and bad medications, but there are also non-medical, non-medication approaches that are useful.
And I remember reading, I think it was Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, or somewhere in that period, but they were talking about one veteran came back and then he died, and they interviewed, I guess, the widow. And she was talking about how he had nightmares his whole life. And then the DSM symptoms, they call it like negative dreams. I don't think they call them nightmares. They call them dreams of... but I guess when I talk about recovery from PTSD, I mean, I was asking about this earlier. I mean, it's sort of some of the symptoms go into remission. I mean, things do get better. People learn to live with it. It is worth going to get treatment. It is worth, reaching out to somebody and saying, it isn't just a matter of how do I treat my symptoms with drugs or alcohol, how do I suffer with it and not tell anybody. I've always felt that one of the great tragedies, and this happens sometimes with sexual abuse victims, is that the actual tragedy itself is horrible enough. But the aftermath of it can be just life for the rest of your life. And if there's shame or something else that affects it, sometimes people don't get the proper help. And they don't reach out. They just think that they're sort of stuck being that way for the rest of their life. And I guess I would encourage anybody who's sort of recognized some of the things that we've talked about or suspect that they may have it, not to hesitate to go reach out to someone.
Because action is really important for this. People have looked at risk factors and, say, resilience factors, factors that help you to be protected against something like that. And a sense of helplessness or other mental illnesses or previous traumas are very much risk factors for PTSD. But the sense of having acted well under the stress or having been effective while the event was happening, as well as having social supports available to you afterwards and being able to be comforted or engaged in that way, those are very important factors in resilience, and I think they play a role too in the treatment afterwards. Right.
Now you mentioned that you went online and saw something about the VA that they have to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different treatments around this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, of course, and exposure, and sort of, again, restructuring the way you look at what had happened is a big, important thing. And there's what's called EMDR, which is eye movement processing, and I forgot that. Desensitization and reprocessing.
Right.
Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. That helps us sort of rework through this, because one of the theories is that PTSD has really come from you're stuck in experience, and you have emotionally, you haven't cognitively, worked through it. But actually, I went to the VA site, and they talk about sort of dealing with stress, and they have what's called an online PTSD coach, and you can look at sort of 17 different areas that are associated with PTSD, whether it's sleep problems, anxiety, reactivity. And you can click on various sites and go through these modules. So actually what I did was I said, I'm not sleeping very well. And I picked that one. I rated my sleep difficulty around a 5 or a 6. Okay. And then it took me through some exercise where I got to pick a picture that was something for me to visualize. And I heard this woman's voice and sort of walk me through the whole thing. And I found it to be quite relaxing and get me a different place. And I could see how it would sort of refocus you from what you're struggling with to again sort of get back in control and get grounded.
And again, I want to mention, if you're a veteran and you feel this, there's you go to VFW and they can put you in touch with, get you up to the White River Junction. We have Exit 1 over here. We have treatment for veterans, Exit 1 outpatient, and I've been over there a couple of times. I found them really helpful. Really nice place. Walk in, make you feel comfortable. Good care, good. And also, if you're in the business of first responders, firemen, policemen, talk to your EAP. Reach out to a local mental health facility. I mean, it's a. I just would hate to think of victims and people who have put themselves out for our country, for our community, who are suffering from these things, and not getting the help.
Right.
For whatever reason, I'd like to really encourage them to sort of reach out a little bit more.
And not to forget that even though we know most about this through war, and veterans coming home, that the more we look at other groups, we realize that there are women from domestic violence, children who have been sexually and physically abused, that these groups as well struggle with PTSD. So it's really ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And to learn to recognize it and have people seek help. So like I'm not a vet. That VA site though has good stuff on it. And there are phone apps around this. There's definitely good treatment others available to people.
Right. And I guess the other thing is that we've been hoping to continue this dialogue and encourage people to call in and ask questions. And so I guess sometimes we tend to lean over toward doing presentations on topics.
Like just you and me talking about things.
Just you and me talking about things. Yeah. But next week, I would like to get back to one of those things and talk a little bit more questions and answers. We have a few come in already on previous shows. We got some good feedback on the spirituality show. We got really nice feedback from Mary Ellen Copeland's show.
Right.
A couple of people asked about getting the book, even though we did the whole.
I got the book. I signed up. Yeah.
So I think I'd like to just again say to folks, please, use the number, use the website, contact us, send us questions, comments, even critical comments. Anything that you may say, because I would love to make this more of a platform for discussion around recovery from mental health and addiction.
Yeah, and we did. We asked for some questions last week, and we don't want the people who responded to think that we're ignoring them. But this being Veterans Day, we thought it was important to talk about PTSD, and to give another week for more of these questions to pile up so that we can address them next week.
Right, and I mentioned my father, and you should mention your dad.
Yeah. Actually, he went to the Korean War, and just like so many other men from this, I can't tell you what kind of action he saw because it is not something that they ever talked about.
You just don't know.
I can see some hints, like we often do with what we know from being professionals, but again, that there shouldn't be this shame in it, and there's good help out there. So please. Any of these resources we've mentioned today, by all means, look into them.
And I was told last week that I wore the same shirt on the last week's show, so I promise you I'll put on a different shirt.
Yeah,
thank you all for tuning in, and thank you all for watching. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
See you next week. Yeah? You all right with that?